The BirdGuides Podcast.
Welcome to episode 7 of the BirdGuides Podcast with me, Josh Jones. David Campbell's here, Ian Lice is here,
Greetings.
and Brian McCloskey is here.
How are you, Josh? What's the crack?
Today we're going to have a delve into some current affairs in birding. We're going to have a look at some of the big stories that have emerged over the past couple of weeks. And today's main topic is AI in bird photography. Now, I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was a recent paper that came out, and it was an opinion piece, came out a few weeks ago, written by Alex Lees and his colleagues, discussing citizen science platforms and their role in mitigating against the threat of generative AI. What really caught my attention in that title is the use of the word threat. And it really got us thinking about the various ways in which AI is already used or involved in birding and photography, but also how increasingly it's going to become prominent in other ways too. So this paper was really interesting because it's really seeing AI as a bad thing, ultimately. And to summarize the paper, the authors have identified two main issues with AI in bird photography. Number one, the fraudulent submission of wholly AI-generated wildlife images, which are passed off as real observations. I'm sure we've probably all seen a bit of that on social media over time, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the second one is the more common problem of AI enhancement tools introducing artifacts that obscure key identifying features and potentially cause misidentification or confusion in various aspects. And now the paper illustrates this with a real case where an AI editing tool, in this case Google's AI image editor, transformed a photo that had been taken in Brazil of the locally common epaulet oriole into something closely resembling a red-winged blackbird, a North American species, which would have been a first for Brazil. So the authors point out that this contamination, as they call it, in other words, essentially distorted or bastardized photographs, can degrade the training data used for AI-assisted species identification tools, which in turn potentially cause further problems down the line. The authors call for various platforms, to adopt stronger image authentication protocols, metadata checks, and contributor education to prevent AI-generated or manipulated slop, as it's quoted, often see that, AI slop, from undermining the scientific reliability of citizen science data. Now, this is a really big topic and a really gnarly issue, which is becoming increasingly problematic, I think it's fair to say. AI, where do we draw the line? Who wants to go on that question?
Gosh, it's a quagmire, isn't it? There's so many grey areas and so much room for confusion, and AI is so prevalent that I think we've all experimented to certain degrees with certain aspects of AI photo editing, and we've probably each found our own personal lessons that we've drawn from that, and where we've maybe stepped back and realized that this stuff is churning out images that maybe isn't the reflection of reality that we thought it might be.
Yeah, and I think the way I see it, there's kind of two primary ways in which problems arise. And the first one is kind of similar to what the paper concluded. It's like the deliberate or malicious use of AI to fake records, basically either make up records or claim something is something that it wasn't, or totally fabricate something, create an image from scratch of a bird that never existed. But then there's also the issue with people using AI to enhance or improve their photographs, but unwittingly introducing errors and inaccuracies along the way, which in turn can lead to an undermining of scientific rigor. I mean, I think the first thing to say from my perspective is that, of course, AI is not new. It's nothing new in photo editing. I suspect we've all taken photos in one form or another over the years of birds, and probably between us we've used tools such as sharpening, denoise, color and brightness, contrast, all of this has been used on programs such as Photoshop or otherwise. It's ultimately, it's all AI. It's not the photograph you've taken, and it is an alteration. But I think for me, like the key is that is enhancing the detail or the pixels that are already there, and therefore I would argue constitutes an acceptable use.
I would agree. I would say that's a key difference if you're taking. I mean, I am a bird watcher primarily and not a bird photographer, and pretty much any photograph I take of a bird, be that with I've got an old bridge camera or by using digiscoping, the end results are pretty much beyond anything that AI could possibly do to help, because they're rubbish. I will not be troubling the BirdGuides Photo of the Week award anytime ever. But the difference is that my photos are a representation of what I've seen and looked at through a lens, and they haven't then been distorted by using artificial intelligence to perhaps crop out a background or move a twig, or, as you say, in some cases improve the bird by adding nice bits of colour to its shoulder panels, which effectively make it into a new species. And I think that's where the problems start.
Yeah. And we have been seeing that, though, where people who, like you, don't profess to be amazing photographers, and they come home with a distant record shot of a bird. They think, oh, there's these new tools that I can just feed this into, and it'll actually make it a nice photo. And it's actually not improving their photo. It's creating something new based on the record shot that they took. And I think that the biggest issue of this is that it is largely undertaken in that quite innocent, naive way, with not much in the way of malicious intent. I think almost always, I think that's the side of this that is the way bigger issue than the active hoaxing, which it does happen, but to be honest, I'm surprised it doesn't happen more. I think it's this culture shift, or just basically this take-up of this technology without really considering the implications. That is. Yeah,
I agree with you. I think the line, is if you're editing something using AI where it fills in the gaps that aren't there in the picture. So there was one example on Twitter or on X there quite recently of a long-tailed shrike, and I think I replied to it because I just thought that's nearly the kind of line that's been crossed where you don't know kind of what's real or what's not anymore. It was a record shot of the long-tailed shrike that was enhanced so much that it was this absolutely crippling shot. And I think if you're filling in the gaps, it's I just think that's not the same as just sharpening something up or brightening or adjusting the exposure and so on. I just think that's a slippery slope, and it will get really, really difficult to actually tell what's real and what's not. I mean, I don't know if anyone saw, there was quite recently, there was just before my trip to Egypt, there was a picture went up online of an African openbill in near Hurghada in Egypt. I mean, that would only, I think, have been the third record for the Western Palearctic, both records previously in Egypt. But it turned out that it was actually a black stork that had been put through AI to look like an openbill. I mean, when stuff like that is, and you're seeing stuff like that cropping up on Facebook and stuff like that all the time, and it's just, this is still in the kind of the early stages of it, and it does make you wonder, in a couple of years. It's I'm not a fan of it anyway.
I think that's the issue, and this is where the line gets crossed for me. It's, as you both alluded to there, essentially it's AI generated artwork of a photo rather than the original photo itself. And that's the key. There was a very succinct response to the long-tailed shrike from my good friend Mark Reed, and he said, the issue is where you're giving AI the scope to imagine what detail should be there that it can't actually make out, or that we can't make out. It basically then becomes AI artwork and not a photo of a bird. And I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah, I agree.
It's hard to argue with that.
Yeah, I think the problem is just getting everybody to see it that way, calling it out and saying, look, we're not enjoying seeing this. We'd rather see your record shot of the bird, and put in another layer to the honour system that birding has always relied upon. I think we're going to need that to extend to photography.
Yeah, that responsibility is absolutely key. But the problem is that in today's world, there's just such an overload of media everywhere. And this kind of thing just happens. People will do it. They will do it to garner attention. They'll do it to increase their following. They'll do it to essentially to make money in some cases, and people lap it up, and that's part of the problem. Unwitting people who don't know any better, they're perhaps not birders, or at least they might at most have a passing interest in birds. And it's not just birds, by the way. It's just that's what we're talking about clearly, because that's what we do. I see so many AI generated images floating about on social media, and you just look at the comments, and it's almost like the comments are the most terrifying thing. It's people just taking it as a given. They're not realizing that it's just total fantasy and it's made up. Whether it's the famous one that's in the Guardian article that was talking about this subject is a toucan sat on an iceberg somewhere in the Antarctic, which is clearly a daft example. But the point is, there are more subtle examples where your non-birder is not going to know any better, and they'll just be like, wow, brilliant shot, and everyone comments and likes on it, and that gets propelled to the top of the algorithm. More people are seeing it, and it goes from there. I've seen recently, just for example, like a common swift sitting on a branch, just in the way that a nightjar would be sat roosting. And it's just like, you know, as a birder, that's just, a common swift isn't going to land on a branch and sit there. That's just not what happens. And there's another one where, you'll probably remember, Chris Gomersall took some of the last photos ever of slender-billed curlew back at Mergerzerga in the 90s. Very famous photos. This bird that is sadly now seemingly gone. And I've seen a series of posts cropping up in the last week or so where AI has essentially created this scene where Chris Gomersall, the photographer, is in the... I'm not even sure if it is him, to be honest, but there's a guy that's purported to be Chris Gomersall carrying a telephoto lens, a modern telephoto lens, bearing in mind he took these photos in the 90s. And then behind him, there's like a beach with loads of waders on, and there's like a Eurasian curlew and some other species. And it's this long story about how Chris Gomersall was here at Mergerzerga taking the last photo of slender-billed curlew, blah, blah, blah. And it's clearly just all AI-generated content, but if you weren't a birder and you didn't know the differences between a slender-billed and a Eurasian curlew, or you didn't realise that slender-billed curlews tend not to walk around on mudflats, they're more of a... in Morocco they were more of a bird of the kind of marshes and grasslands. So certainly in the context of Chris's photographs they were. You wouldn't know any better if you don't know the story behind them. So you're just taking this stuff as gospel, and actually it's just complete and utter nonsense. So it's pretty scary.
Yeah, I mean, how do you deal with it? Better moderation, EXIF data?
I think what we see more widely, moderation has been reduced over recent years on social media platforms. So unfortunately, I just don't see how that's going to have any realistic impact, because you're fighting the tide all the time, it seems.
I think rarities committees will have to bring in some sort of regulation as to how they'll accept photos of purported rarities, be that just the original raw file or unadulterated original images.
It's going to make things really difficult. Yeah, it's going to get really difficult. I mean, I suppose it is kind of a new challenge, but it's kind of scary to think where it could go, and whether it goes back to needing written descriptions, or at the very least kind of the raw file. I think that's probably the way it's gonna have to go. Yeah.
I saw Mark Golly suggesting circling back to descriptions, which just seems so ironic. After 2 or 3 years ago we were talking as this is the moment to say it's photos or it didn't happen. And I think some committees have been going down those lines, haven't they? That it's photos or a sound recording for a record to go through, and now we need to question that. But of course, if we call for written descriptions to go alongside, then you could easily just get your AI to write that.
Where does it end? Like I did Mark's quote though, notebook skills never grow old. That was quite good. I did enjoy that one.
Yeah, they have faded into obscurity though. I think it's a bit of a lost art.
It's pretty scary though. We mentioned a couple of examples there, but another one that popped up recently that I saw was on Blue Sky. It was Thomas Miller, who had used ChatGPT to enhance, sharpen and denoise a very distant, I hope you won't mind me saying, quite poor record shot of a black kite in Oxfordshire. You could tell what it was from the photo, don't get me wrong, that's not the point, but he decided to have a play with chat and just see what it came back with, and it was pretty bonkers. The result, in one of the photos, the bird was the wrong way up flying, and in another, I think it had 8 long primaries on one wing rather than 6. They're glaring errors if you're a birder, but again, it kind of circles back to that point of if you're none the wiser, you don't necessarily know to look for this stuff. Be scary.
Yeah, and we should say that Thomas was pointing out that it had turned. He did realise that it was coming up with a result that he was not desiring, and he was posting it as an example.
Yes, exactly.
This is how it can really throw the really important details like the wing structure of a black kite. It can just throw them off.
Absolutely. Again, this whole grey area thing, circling back to what Ian mentioned with his lovely record shots, in terms of, I think we're all in agreement that things like sharpening, denoise, brightness, contrast, that sort of slight alterations are all pretty reasonable as long as the image isn't massively changed in any sort of significant way. But there are a couple of other grey areas which I noted down, which I've done myself when I've taken photos and edited them in Photoshop. And that's things like cloning or removing twigs or perceived clutter or changing a background, perhaps. A lot of people use Gaussian blur to simulate a shallower depth of field, so you take that distracting background out of a photo. And I feel like that's a bit of a grey area. I suppose you could argue that if the bird doesn't change, then that's okay, but I think it is on the lines of what's acceptable and what's not. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I think it's,
I guess it depends.
Clinging by its fingertips onto the very edge of the grey area there, I think.
Yeah, it depends where it's going to be used, doesn't it? If it's a citizen science platform where those photos are going to be fed into some kind of machine learning or some kind of analysis on habitat structure or whatever, then clearly you wouldn't want those alterations to be made. But even though they may now be removing that twig via AI, I don't see how that's any different really from a few years ago when you'd have been removing it from a more manual tool on Photoshop. It's the same result, whereas the new AI alterations, that's the means by which a lot of these other edits are being made that might actually be altering the finer details of the bird.
I'm not mad into photography at all, but I would just say leave the original picture and edit it in terms of like the sharpening and stuff like that. I think when you go down that route, I think it kind of gets a little bit messy. It's hard to know. I mean, where, like you say, where do you kind of draw the line with stuff like that? It kind of look at. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm just like I'm happy enough if I get record shots and stuff like that, and I realize there is bird photographers out there who take photography quite seriously. But I think you're kind of half fabricating an image then,
Yeah. I think it also just comes down to, as David alluded to as well, a greater responsibility from the people that know better or should know better. That's us birders. I've lost count of the amount of times I've seen strange editing by photographers, or what I would personally say was poor editing, but by experienced photographers who've shared so many wonderful images, for example, in BirdGuides and elsewhere over the years. But yeah, you don't know, it's like the unwitting overuse of AI to edit photographs. One of the big problems, I think, is the Topaz Labs software that's increasingly being used by bird photographers in Britain and beyond. I've used it myself, and in many cases it's absolutely brilliant. Don't get me wrong, I'm not slating the product. It works really well, but you have a responsibility as a photographer to realise when it's not working well. I've seen a few examples recently. There was, for example, that brown booby at Bempton a few weeks back that flew past a small group of shocked observers just standing at one of the viewpoints, and the photo of the bird had been edited. The facial expression on the bird to me just didn't look realistic when you zoomed in. It just didn't look like a brown booby.
Its feet were a bit weird.
The feet were the craziest bits. I mean, boobies, right? They've got 3 toes, webbed feet. This individual seemed to have 8 or 9 toes, and the pattern to me looked more like a fan than it did a booby's foot. And you should be noticing that. I believe there's a responsibility as an experienced birder or a photographer, whoever it is, you should be noticing things like that before you share things in the public domain. Because ultimately, and I hate to single out that example because there are so many examples of it that are popping up week after week, you're posting the images like that in a public domain where people who are less experienced than you are going to be absorbing them, and they don't know any better, and all of a sudden it's fine for a brown booby to have more than 3 toes, for example. So yeah, it's a grey area, but the way AI is going, I can't really see it being resolved anytime soon, to be honest.
It's a mess. I hate it. But talking about sharpening, and that brown booby obviously being quite overcooked in terms of AI sharpening, but if you dialed that right down to the sort of bottom end of the tool in the software, it might not be so noticeable. But talking as a layman, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but might there be aspects in that image through AI sharpening, even though it might not look bad when you're sitting there at the computer, that could actually, on a finer scale, in some kind of analysis or machine learning, that could throw a spanner in the works? That wouldn't have been the case with rewind 10 years to Photoshop sharpen tool, where it's just presumably, as far as I understand, doing it by a slightly different.
Yeah, and I think that
mechanism.
ultimately takes us back round to the top of the pod, and that this is the underlying point of Alex and his colleagues' paper. It's, this is where the problems lie. People are, with the best intentions, using AI to improve their bird photos and actually creating problems in the first place, which can then, feed into, I don't know, whether it's the Macaulay Library, the BirdGuides Gallery, or any other massive database of birding imagery or other media, and it's causing problems. So yeah, that's the issue, and it is a massive challenge, and ultimately I think it's probably going to come down to a collective responsibility among experienced birders and photographers to make sure that doesn't happen, or at least minimises the issue, the cases where it does happen.
Yeah, and another thing I've noticed is on stock image libraries, when you're trying to find an image of a particular species, on some of them you scroll down the page not very far and there's photos of, say, a dotterel. That's great. And then there's some really weird AI mashup of a bird that's being sold for £15 as a commercial image that's labelled as, say, a dotterel, but it's just a complete fantasy of a creature. And those are presumably being bought by somebody and included in some kind of publication. Or,
image
or
libraries, these big stock libraries, they need to be better in those cases for sure, especially if they're making money out of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because that's going to really mislead
And then you
people.
notice it's got 3 legs.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, which has happened, doesn't it?
Yeah, it has.
Anyway, yeah, it's a big and it's a murky issue, AI, and it's only going to get bigger and murkier, I think it's fair to say, as we move forward. We're going to take a short break now, but we'll be back shortly with some more of the latest birding stories. Welcome back to the BirdGuides Podcast. In the second half of the show, we're going to have a look at another upland bird, following on from our recent pod where we discussed the decline of Eurasian dotterel in Britain. We're looking today at Ring Ouzel, this time in Ireland, and a recent paper has shown, following a study and fieldwork that was carried out in 2021, that unfortunately Ring Ouzel is now in a very precarious situation as an Irish breeding bird. This is a species that was previously much more widespread and more numerous, but only 9 occupied tetrads were found, all of which were in County Donegal, and the paper also cited the recent loss of a population in County Kerry. Issues, there seem to be several, but the key ones from the paper seem to be disturbance, but crucially overgrazing. And it leaves the species in a pretty bleak place in Ireland. Is there any way back, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty bleak. I know the last place now where Ring Ouzels are breeding is Glenveigh, which is a national park, and the grazing between sheep and deer is just, it's a real shame, because you would think a national park should be just left and managed correctly, but it really isn't. I mean, I know birders who have seen Ring Ouzels, on breeding grounds in Kerry and Wicklow and Donegal, but it's really looking quite bleak. I mean, Ring Ouzel is, even away from breeding grounds, is quite a tricky species in Ireland. I mean, I've only seen three Ring Ouzels.
Only 3, wow.
Yeah, I mean, to put that into comparison, like I've seen 3 Baltimore Orioles in Ireland,
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really difficult species, and that's not for the lack of being out west or down in County Cork, when they're passing through, but they're really quite a tricky species. And a friend of mine, Victor Kashiri, is one of Ireland's highest listers, who's been birding between Cape Clear and Mizen Head every October since the 80s, and last year was the first year he ever missed Ring Ouzel in West Cork in October. I mean, wow. Just look at it. I realize birds in October and autumn may well be from Scandinavia and places like that, but it just seems a bit bleak. If you spend a month in West Cork and you miss a Ring Ouzel, it's kind of paints a pretty bleak picture. Yeah, it's a species I've never seen on breeding grounds. So yeah, in Ireland that is. Yeah.
It's not looking great in the UK either, is it, Dave?
No, they already disappeared from Galloway, I was reading earlier, a while back. And I gather they have even been struggling in Ireland since the 60s, 70s, when the first surveys were done.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Right, Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not exactly a new thing, but it feels like we're really on the edge of them just bowing out entirely. Yeah, them tending to nest more on the ground in Britain and Ireland is a disadvantage when you've got so many sheep going around. Whereas in Europe, it sounds like they more often use
I
trees.
didn't realise that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And apparently in the wintering areas, habitat changes around the Western Mediterranean, that might be impacting our wintering birds and Ireland's wintering birds too. So they've not just got the pressures on the breeding grounds, they've got it where they're seeing out the winter too.
Yeah, 43% decrease in distribution between 1968 to 72 and 2008 to 2011 per BTO data. So yeah, pretty bleak for Ring Ouzel, really. It's one of those birds that seems to still be holding up across most places on migration, but unlike I think with dotterel, you probably can't quite read as much into that as you perhaps would with dotterel, for example. Like a lot of birds, especially in autumn, Ring Ouzels, sometimes you get these big arrivals on the east coast, especially in the southeast, and they're clearly all continental birds, which probably doesn't have a direct relationship to the birds we're seeing or not seeing up on northern breeding grounds in the UK. But even so, it does seem to be a species that certainly around me is on the wane, I think, as a migrant.
I imagine these dry conditions are going to be helping either finding invertebrates, worms, so on in the soil. And yeah, I remember Sean Renane's film Birdsong. That's quite a haunting section on Ring
Especially,
Ouzel.
I think he regarded them to be functionally extinct, which is really quite sad. You know, it's just seems to be a species that will disappear from Ireland as a breeding species, which it's certainly not ideal.
And is that a similar situation with windchat in Ireland, Brian? That
Windchat's
seems very scarce there.
Windchat is getting really, really scarce. Even one of the best known places for them in Wicklow, I think. I mean, when I was younger, they were so easy to find. You'd rock up to this little bridge in the Wicklow Mountains, and windchats would be everywhere. But they've gone really, really difficult to find, and there may only be one or two more pairs in that area. Actually, last year was when I was going up for the song sparrow. I actually had a windchat fly across the road in front of the car, pulled in, and this was up in Glenveigh, kind of the same general area as the Ring Ouzels. And I got out of the car, and there was a cracking singing male windchat, but they are in trouble as well. They seem to have a bit of a bleak future as well. So yeah,
Yeah, it's a similar situation for windchat really in the UK as well. The population still seems to be in free for all, sadly. But some happier news. Let's move on to some happier news, and that was what came out this week about Roseate Terns at Coquet Island in Northumberland. Sounds like 2026 has been another excellent breeding year for Britain's only regular Roseate Tern colony. 156 breeding pairs there, with more than 150 fledglings getting off, which is absolutely phenomenal news given that they were hit by avian influenza back in 2022.
You wouldn't expect it to be so quick, the recovery, would you? Yeah, best numbers in 50 years.
Yeah, amazing, really. There was a bit of a drop-off after or during the avian flu outbreak, and I know that a lot of people feared the worst, but 2024, which was the first year after avian flu had passed through the terns, there were 126 pairs, which was the lowest for a few years. But that increased rapidly to 154 last year, and then of course 156 this year. So seems like there's a decent amount of resilience there. Of course, it's a very rare bird in Britain, but it's significantly more numerous as an Irish breeding bird, Brian.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, there's two really big colonies. Rockabill, which is off Dublin, that's where the sooty tern was all those years ago. That is, I think it's something like 1,600 pairs. So on the east coast, Roseate Tern is not a difficult bird, particularly at this time of the year. And the other big colony is in Ladies Island, which is in County Wexford. So the whole kind of east coast, like for example, I went down for the grey-headed wagtail. A friend of mine, Cian Cardiff, found a lovely male grey-headed wagtail down in Ladies Island a couple of weeks back, and I saw it there recently, and I completely forgot how good it is for Roseate Terns down there. I mean, you'd literally flying overhead, calling everywhere, amazing flybys, great photographic opportunities, and it's the kind of place I really should go back down and spend a bit more time with them, because closer to me, you get them on beaches at, in tern roosts in the evening. Like for example, I think it was Friday evening, I had a couple of Roseate Terns at a place called Cruisetown Strand in County Louth. And yeah, it's really nice seeing them, but the views in Wexford are just absolutely unbelievable. So yeah, I've actually got it on my British list as well.
Have you?
I've seen one. I saw a lovely adult at the Steiniger Scoter in Musselburgh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was just fishing offshore. That was a really nice bird actually. I can't imagine they're that numerous in that area.
No, they're not.
Yeah. I think
that's a pretty good bird
There's
up there,
obviously a small population for them to come from anyway, certainly compared to the Irish population. But it's basically, unless you go to cook it in midsummer, or you do one of these sort of established tern roost sites along the northeast coast in July and August, or maybe into September, they tend to be very hit and miss in the UK. I mean, there's been the odd breeding record elsewhere, for example, Hampshire in 2024, and there seem to be semi-regular records, presumably Irish birds from Anglesey, for example. But it's a hard bird in Britain, generally speaking.
Yeah, I went to Minsmere to see. There was a pair knocking around at Minsmere this summer. I think there were 3. I had really good views of a pair there, but other than that, I hadn't seen a roseate tern in Britain for many years. It's got very hard for a birder from the southeast.
Have you ever had one up the KGV in?
No, it would be, as far as I'm aware, a first for the King George if one were to rock in.
It's one of my most enjoyable patch. I say enjoyable, it was also extremely frustrating, but I had one May morning on my patch. I'd just done the rounds of my patch, and this is the gravel pits in South Lincolnshire. Done the sort of rounds. It was quite a muggy and warm morning. I think it was about the 7th of May, give or take, something like that anyway. I'd done the rounds and it had been pretty quiet, which was disappointing considering it felt like one of those turny sort of days when it's heavily overheads are there and it feels warm and muggy. And yeah, I just stopped to look at some gulls that were on a pretty unsuspecting pit that I've never seen much on before, and there was a tern sat amongst them, and I thought, looks like it's got a dark bill, and I got the scope on it. It was a flipping roseate tern. So I've got we've got some very brief video of it sitting there and getting pecked at by black-headed gulls, and all of about a minute's footage just to document it. And then I put the news out and tried to get closer. Went round, there was a willow tree just to my left. I walked round the other side of the willow tree to try and get a slightly better angle, and it disappeared in the space of about 10 seconds. It had just disappeared.
Oh.
But yeah, that's, I think, the only modern Peterborough area record. It's definitely a rare migrant, but it does seem to pop in at these spots from time to time, doesn't it, on passage? And if the coquet population continues to increase, then maybe it's going to become a more regular thing for us inland patch birders.
We can only hope.
What about you, Dave? Are they regular down your way or not?
I'd say they are annual at Rye Harbour. Late summer, you get some sort of post, I think initially some failed breeders and then some post-breeding birds just loafing around, probably in a similar manner to how Brian sees his patches, often in the evening. And yeah, they're an annual bird at Rye Harbour, but I've not seen one
probably to come in the next few weeks, hopefully.
I hope so. Yeah, it feels like any time between late June and mid to late August, you've got a shout at them.
It's funny as well because I probably don't appreciate them enough in Ireland. I mean, because they're such a brilliant bird. But I've kind of find every time I see them, I'm looking for something else. So like in the tern roost, in the tern roost, I'm looking for black terns or twitching something else down in Wexford or whatever it may be. But they really are brilliant birds. I love their call as well. Yeah, they're so distinctive. But yeah, it's something I probably should spend a bit more time watching.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't know how lucky you are, mate.
That's
all I'll say. Roseate Terns, lovely birds, and by all accounts, looks like we're going to be seeing more of them in the years to come, all being well. That's all we've got time for today. Thanks for listening, and it's great to have you with us as always. If you want to keep up to date with everything that BirdGuides does, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter, which is delivered to your inbox every Monday at 5 o'clock to hear all of the latest birding news and stories, also reviews, articles, and lots of other content to enjoy as well. And also, if you want to check out the latest sightings, head to birdguides.com/sightings. A membership is required, but you are entitled to a free 30-day trial if you haven't had one previously. But that's all we've got time for, and we'll see you again soon.
Cheers.
Yep.
You have been listening to the BirdGuides Podcast. For the latest and best birding content, visit birdguides.com.